794 AD, Heian Kyo. To understand the samurai, we must first understand a world that had almost nothing to do with them. Imagine, if you will, a Japan defined not by the clash of steel, but by the delicate stroke of a calligraphy brush. This is the Heian period, an era of unparalleled aesthetic refinement, where the highest measure of a man was not his prowess in battle, but his ability to compose a perfect poem or appreciate the subtle melancholy of a falling cherry blossom. The capital, Heian-kyo, modern-day Kyoto, was a jewel of organized elegance. Here, the imperial court existed in a bubble of ritual and ceremony, insulated from the harsh realities of the provinces. The aristocracy, known as the Kyuj, lived lives governed by complex etiquette and an obsession with beauty. For these nobles, politics was a game of shadows played through poetry, scent, and silk. To rise in rank, one did not need a strong arm. One needed a sophisticated palate and a mastery of the waka poetic form. This was a world of miyabi, courtly elegance. The literature of the time, most notably the works of Murasaki Shikibu, reveals a society deeply preoccupied with the ephemeral nature of existence. They lived in a state of beautiful decay, finding spiritual meaning in the fleeting moments of the seasons. The halls of the palace were filled with the scent of expensive incense and the rustle of multi-layered silk robes. It was a civilization of the mind and the senses, a gilded age where the emperor sat at the pinnacle of a cosmic order, seemingly untouched by the grit and grime of the earth. But beneath this veneer of exquisite grace, the foundations of the Heian world were beginning to crack. While the courtiers in the capital debated the nuances of a poem or the correct shade of a fan, the countryside was changing. The central government's grip on the provinces was loosening. The tax systems were failing, and the imperial authority was becoming increasingly ceremonial, more concerned with the aesthetics of rule than the mechanics of it. In the distant reaches of the islands, far from the incense-filled halls of Heian-kyo, a new class of people was emerging. These were the provincial landowners, the men who lived by the rhythm of the harvest and the reality of the terrain. They were rugged, practical, and most importantly, they were armed. As local disputes over land and water rights escalated, these landowners realized that the refined poets in the capital could not, and would not, protect them. The vacuum left by the waning imperial authority created a desperate need for local order. The court was looking inward, obsessed with its own splendor, while the periphery was looking toward survival. It was in this widening gap between the elegance of the court and the necessity of the frontier that the seeds of the warrior class were sown. The Heian period was a magnificent sunset, a golden age of art and intellect that would eventually cast long, dark shadows. And as the sun set on the era of the poet, it began to rise on the era of the sword. The stage was being set for a transformation that would redefine the soul of Japan, the birth of the samurai. 9th century, the Japanese provinces. As the sun set on the centralized authority of the imperial court, a new and more rugged reality began to take shape in the shadows of the mountains and the vastness of the coastal plains. To understand how a poet becomes a warrior, we must look to the soil itself. For centuries, the land had been organized under the Ritsuryo system, a centralized legal structure where all land technically belonged to the emperor, and the peasantry paid taxes in grain and silk to support the splendor of the capital. But by the middle of the Heian period, this system was hemorrhaging. The imperial government, increasingly preoccupied with the delicate rituals of court life, found itself unable to manage the vast, sprawling territories of the provinces. Taxes went uncollected, law enforcement became a memory, and the central bureaucracy grew too bloated and detached to respond to the needs of the periphery. In this atmosphere of administrative decay, a new phenomenon emerged: the rise of the shun, or private, tax-exempt estates. Driven by a desire to bypass the heavy-handed and often corrupt imperial tax collectors, powerful families and ambitious individuals began to consolidate land. They carved out private domains, creating a patchwork of autonomous territories that operated outside the direct control of the emperor. This was a revolution of ownership. The men who controlled these shun were not the silk-clad aristocrats of Kyoto. They were the provincial landowners, the local elites, the minor officials, and the ambitious frontiersmen. These landowners were the new architects of order. As they expanded their holdings, they faced a constant stream of challenges. Land was not merely a source of wealth. It was the ultimate prize in a zero-sum game. Disputes over irrigation rights, boundary lines, and forest access were frequent and often violent. With the central government's police forces nowhere to be found, these landowners realized a fundamental truth of survival: ownership without the means to defend it was an illusion. To protect their crops, their families, and their growing prestige, these provincial elites began to organize. They didn't just hire mercenaries, they built lineages of strength. They began to arm themselves and their kin, creating small, private militias to patrol their borders and settle local grievances. The focus of their lives shifted from the pursuit of aesthetic perfection to the pursuit of security and stability. This was the birth of a new social necessity. The vacuum of power left by the retreating imperial shadow was being filled by the iron will of the local strongman. These men were practical, pragmatic, and increasingly organized into clans. They were defined not by the elegance of their calligraphy, but by the reliability of their blades and the strength of their fortifications. The transition was subtle at first, but its implications were seismic. The very concept of authority was being redefined. It was no longer a divine mandate descending from the emperor in the capital. It was a localized, physical reality maintained through strength and land ownership. The provincial landowner had become the new pivot point of Japanese society. They had turned the land into a fortress, and in doing so, they had created a demand for a specialized class of professional protector. The era of the scholar official was receding, and the era of the armed protector was being forged in the crucible of provincial necessity. The seeds of the warrior class had not just been sown, they had taken root in the very earth of Japan. 10th century, the imperial capital of Heian. As the provincial landowners fortified their estates, a strange and paradoxical phenomenon began to occur within the halls of the imperial court itself. The very aristocracy that had retreated into a world of poetry and incense was now forced to acknowledge the growing power of the men they had once dismissed as mere provincial brutes. To maintain their grip on power and settle their own internal disputes, the high-ranking nobles began to do something unthinkable. They began to sponsor these provincial militias, elevating certain warrior families into the service of the throne. It was through this marriage of courtly prestige and provincial muscle that two great lineages emerged, destined to collide and reshape the destiny of Japan: the Taira and the Minamoto. Both clans shared a common origin, tracing their lineage back to the imperial family itself. They were descendants of emperors who had been stripped of their royal status and relegated to the fringes of society. But while they shared a common bloodline, their paths to power could not have been more different. The Terra, or hike, were the first to master the art of the political climb. They did not merely stay in the provinces. They moved into the heart of the capital. Through strategic marriages, shrewd alliances, and the careful cultivation of influence within the court, the Terra transformed themselves from simple warriors into sophisticated political players. They became the indispensable enforcers of the aristocracy. By the mid-12th century, the Terra had achieved something no warrior clan had ever done. They had effectively captured the machinery of the state. Under the leadership of the formidable Terra no Kiyomari, the clan reached the zenith of its power, commanding not just armies but the very levers of imperial administration. For a moment, it seemed the sword had finally become one with the silk. But the Terra's ascent created a vacuum of resentment, and in the shadows of the provinces, the Minamoto, or Genji, were watching. Unlike the Terra, the Minamoto remained more closely tied to the rugged, martial traditions of the countryside. They were the quintessential warriors, defined by a raw, unyielding strength and a fierce sense of independence. While the Terra were busy navigating the intricate social hierarchies of Kyoto, the Minamoto were honing their combat skills and building deep, unbreakable bonds with the provincial landholders. They were the masters of the frontier, a clan built not on political maneuvering, but on the ironclad loyalty of the warrior bond. The tension between these two houses was not merely a personal feud. It was a clash of two different visions for Japan. On one side stood the Terra, a class attempting to bridge the gap between the warrior and the aristocrat, seeking to rule through the existing structures of the court. On the other stood the Minamoto, a class that represented the pure, unadulterated power of the provincial military, a force that saw the court as a distant, decaying relic. As the 12th century progressed, this rivalry ceased to be a simmer and began to boil. The delicate balance between the court and the clans was breaking. The Terra had become too powerful, too integrated into a corrupt system, and too perceived as too much like the nobles. The Minamoto, fueled by a desire to reclaim their ancestral dignity and challenge the Terra hegemony, stood ready. The stage was set for a struggle that would move beyond local land disputes and escalate into a total war for the soul of the nation. The rivalry of the Terra and the Minamoto was no longer just a family feud. It was the spark that would ignite the Genpei War, and in its flames, the era of the samurai would truly begin. Late 12th century, the rugged provinces of Japan. As the shadow of the Genpei War began to lengthen, a fundamental question emerged from the smoke of the battlefield. What exactly makes a warrior? Before the wars had even reached their bloody crescendo, a distinct identity was crystallizing within the hearts of the combatants. We often speak of Bushido, the way of the warrior, as a monolithic, ancient code, a set of rigid laws handed down through the centuries. But in this era, Bushido was not yet a finished temple. It was a collection of seeds, scattered across the blood-soaked soil of the provinces. In these early days, there was no written manual. There were no formal academies teaching the philosophy of the blade. Instead, the code was a living, breathing thing, forged in the crucible of survival and necessity. It was a set of unwritten expectations passed from father to son, from commander to vassal, and from master to retainer. At its most primal level, these early seeds were planted in the concept of jiri, social and moral obligation. For a warrior, loyalty was not a choice. It was the very fabric of his existence. To break a vow to one's lord was not merely a tactical error, it was a spiritual death. This bond was the glue that held the provincial clans together. In a land where central authority was crumbling, your survival depended entirely on the strength of your connections and the absolute reliability of those standing beside you in the shield wall. Alongside loyalty grew the seed of Mayo, or honor. In the early Heian and Kamakura transitions, honor was inextricably linked to reputation and lineage. A warrior's name was his most precious possession. To fight with cowardice, to flee from a superior foe, or to dishonor one's clan was to erase one's ancestors from history. This was not a pursuit of abstract morality, but a practical necessity of a warrior society. A man without honor was a man without allies, and a man without allies was a dead man. We also see the emergence of a specific martial etiquette, a ritualization of violence. Even in the chaos of early skirmishes, there was a growing sense that combat was not merely butchery, but a disciplined art. The way a warrior approached an opponent, the manner in which he displayed his achievements, and the respect shown to a fallen foe began to take shape. This was the beginning of the warrior's aesthetic, the idea that even in the midst of death, there must be a certain dignity, a certain grace. However, it is important to understand that these early codes were often brutal and contradictory. The way was frequently at odds with the reality of the battlefield. The drive for glory often clashed with the necessity of cunning. The demand for loyalty often led to devastating internal purges. These were the raw, unpolished roots of what would later become the legendary Bushido. They were born of blood, shaped by the harsh realities of provincial life, and driven by a desperate need for order in a world of chaos. As the Terra and the Minamoto prepared to tear the nation apart, they were not just fighting for land or titles. They were inadvertently defining the very soul of the warrior class. The seeds were sown, and the harvest would be a legacy that would define Japan for a millennium. Late 12th century, the rugged provinces of Japan. The seeds of honor and obligation that had been germinating in the provinces were about to be watered by a deluge of blood. The tension between the two great clans, the Terra and the Minamoto, had reached a breaking point. For decades, the Terra clan had ascended like a rising tide, infiltrating the imperial court, marrying into the aristocracy, and effectively eclipsing the very emperor they were sworn to protect. To the provincial warriors of the Minamoto, the Terra were no longer mere defenders of the realm. They were usurpers who had traded the purity of the sword for the decadence of the court. The spark that ignited the powder keg was not a single event, but a series of political miscalculations that forced the Minamoto out of the shadows and into open rebellion. What followed was the Genpei War, a cataclysmic struggle that would tear the heart out of Japan and redefine its destiny. This was not a war of grand, organized armies in the modern sense. It was a clash of legacies. It was a conflict where the refined, court-influenced tactics of the Terra met the raw, unyielding ferocity of the Minamoto. As the fighting spread from the western seas to the eastern plains, the scale of the violence began to overwhelm the traditional structures of society. The provinces were no longer just breeding grounds for warriors. They were becoming vast, churning engines of war. The conflict reached its psychological and physical zenith in the year 1185. At the Battle of Dan no Yura, the very essence of the era was laid bare. On the churning waters of the Shimonoseki Strait, the Terra fleet was cornered. The fighting was desperate, a chaotic swirl of arrows, blades, and splintering wood. In a moment of profound tragedy that would haunt Japanese literature for 1,000 years, the Terra leadership realized their doom. Rather than face the indignity of capture, the Terra elite, including the child emperor Antoku, were cast into the depths of the sea. The tide did not just wash away a clan, it washed away the old world order. With the fall of the Terra, the Minamoto emerged as the undisputed masters of the land. But the victory was bittersweet. The war had proven that the imperial court, for all its poetry and prestige, was a hollow shell, incapable of maintaining order in a world governed by the blade. The warriors had realized a terrifying truth. They no longer needed to serve the court. They could rule in its place. The Genpei War acted as a violent crucible. It took those raw, unpolished seeds of loyalty and honor we discussed previously and tempered them in the fires of total war. The chaos of the conflict demanded a new kind of leadership, a military government capable of wielding both the sword and the law. As the smoke cleared from the battlefields of Dan no Yura, the landscape of Japan had been irrevocably altered. The era of the courtier was dying, and the era of the shogun was being born. The struggle between the Terra and the Minamoto had done more than just decide which clan would hold power. It had shifted the very axis of Japanese civilization from the elegance of the palace to the discipline of the camp. The sword had not just won a war, it had claimed the future. 1185, the ruins of Dan no Yura and the silent halls of Kyoto. The sea had swallowed the Terra, and with them, the illusion that the imperial court could dictate the fate of the islands. For centuries, the emperor had been the sun around which all of Japan orbited, a divine, untouchable figurehead whose authority was absolute in theory, if not in practice. But as the blood of the Genpei War soaked into the soil, the sun began to dim, overshadowed by the rising shadow of the warrior. The transition from courtly rule to military dominance was not an overnight coup, but a profound tectonic shift in the soul of the nation. It was the moment when the civilized world of the Heian period, a world defined by calligraphy, incense, and complex etiquette, was forcibly eclipsed by a martial world defined by logistics, land rights, and the cold reality of steel. In the wake of the carnage, Minamoto no Yoritomo, the architect of the Minamoto victory, looked toward the east. He did not look toward the gilded palaces of Kyoto, where the courtiers continued to debate poetry amidst the stench of decay. Instead, he looked toward Kamakura. This was a deliberate, strategic divorce from the old order. By establishing his base far from the corrupting influence and political entanglements of the capital, Yoritomo was signaling that the center of gravity had moved. The heart of Japan was no longer beating in the imperial palace. It was beating in the garrison and the encampment. This shift created a dual reality that would define Japan for centuries. On one hand, you had the imperial court, the keepers of tradition, the masters of ritual, and the source of all formal legitimacy. On the other, you had the new military government, the bakufu, or tent government. The term itself is telling. It evokes the imagery of a commander in the field, a ruler whose authority is derived not from divine lineage alone, but from the ability to command men and hold territory. The court still held the prestige, but the samurai held the power. The emperor remained the sacred vessel of the state, but he was becoming a prisoner of his own tradition, a ritualistic figurehead, while the shogun wielded the actual reins of governance. The bureaucracy of the state was being replaced by a hierarchy of vassalage. Loyalty was no longer owed to an abstract imperial ideal, but to a direct lord in exchange for the right to hold land. This was the birth of a new social contract. The shift from court to sword, meant that legitimacy was now being forged in the crucible of combat and maintained through the strict administration of military law. The refined elegance of the aristocrat was being judged against the pragmatic discipline of the warrior. As the dust of the Genpei War settled, the fundamental question of Japanese identity had been answered. The era of the poet-statesman was over. The era of the professional soldier had begun. The sword had not merely replaced the brush. It had become the foundation upon which all subsequent Japanese law, culture, and social structure would be built. The stage was set for a new kind of ruler, a new kind of era, and the rise of the first true shogunate. 1185, the rugged coastline of Kamakura. If the Genpei War was the storm that broke the old world, then Kamakura was the fortress built from its wreckage. While the imperial court in Kyoto remained draped in silk and steeped in the heavy incense of ancient rituals, a new, harder reality was taking root in the east. This was not a city of sprawling gardens and poetic retreats. It was a stronghold, carved into the hills and protected by the sea and the mountains. It was a place designed for survival, for vigilance, and for the command of men. Minamoto no Yoritomo, having emerged from the fires of civil war as the undisputed master of the warrior class, understood a truth that his predecessors had ignored. To rule Japan, one could not be a part of the Kyoto court. To be a courtier was to be a hostage to tradition, to be entangled in the web of aristocratic intrigue and the stagnant politics of the palace. Yoritomo sought something different. He sought a government that was mobile, disciplined, and above all, grounded in the reality of land and loyalty. By establishing the Kamakura Bakufu, Yoritomo did more than just move his headquarters. He institutionalized the warrior class. This was the birth of the first shogunate, the first time the military had created a formal, administrative structure that could rival the centuries-old legitimacy of the imperial throne. The word bakufu, meaning tent government, was a profound statement of intent. It signaled that the government was no longer a sedentary bureaucracy of scholars, but a mobile command center of generals. The foundation of this new order was the system of vassalage. In the old imperial system, power flowed downward from a divine mandate. In the Kamakura system, power flowed through a direct, reciprocal bond of blood and soil. The shogun offered protection and, most importantly, the legal recognition of land rights. In return, the samurai offered absolute, unwavering loyalty and military service. This was the Goknin system, the houseman of the shogun. For the provincial warrior, the shogun was not a distant deity, but a provider of justice and a guarantor of their very livelihood. This era introduced a radical new way of managing a nation. Through the establishment of the shugo, military governors, and the jid, land stewards, the shogunate planted the seeds of military administration into every corner of the Japanese countryside. These officials were the eyes and ears of the bakufu, responsible for policing the provinces and collecting taxes, effectively bypassing the traditional imperial administrative channels. However, this new order was inherently unstable, built upon a delicate tension. Japan had entered an era of dual government. The emperor remained the sacred source of all authority, the sun around which the cultural soul of the nation revolved. But the shogun was the shadow that actually moved across the land. The court held the prestige, but the bakufu held the steel. As the Kamakura period took hold, the social fabric of Japan was being rewoven. The hierarchy was no longer determined by how well one could compose a waka poem or navigate the complexities of court etiquette, but by one's position within the military hierarchy. The sword had become the ultimate arbiter of law. The era of the courtier was fading into memory, and the age of the warrior had truly, irrevocably begun. 1185, the rugged coastline of Kamakura. If the Genpei War was the storm that broke the old world, then Kamakura was the fortress built from its wreckage. While the imperial court in Kyoto remained draped in silk and steeped in the heavy incense of ancient rituals, a new, harder reality was taking root in the east. This was not a city of sprawling gardens and poetic retreats. It was a stronghold, carved into the hills and protected by the sea and the mountains. It was a place designed for survival, for vigilance, and for the command of men. Minamoto no Yoritomo, having emerged from the fires of civil war as the undisputed master of the warrior class, understood a truth that his predecessors had ignored. To rule Japan, one could not be a part of the Kyoto court. To be a courtier was to be a hostage to tradition, to be entangled in the web of aristocratic intrigue and the stagnant politics of the palace. Yoritomo sought something different. He sought a government that was mobile, disciplined, and above all, grounded in the reality of land and loyalty. By establishing the Kamakura Bakufu, Yoritomo did more than just move his headquarters. He institutionalized the warrior class. This was the birth of the first shogunate, the first time the military had created a formal, administrative structure that could rival the centuries-old legitimacy of the imperial throne. The word bakufu, meaning tent government, was a profound statement of intent. It signaled that the government was no longer a sedentary bureaucracy of scholars, but a mobile command center of generals. The foundation of this new order was the system of vassalage. In the old imperial system, power flowed downward from a divine mandate. In the Kamakura system, power flowed through a direct, reciprocal bond of blood and soil. The shogun offered protection and, most importantly, the legal recognition of land rights. In return, the samurai offered absolute, unwavering loyalty and military service. This was the Goknin system, the houseman of the shogun. For the provincial warrior, the shogun was not a distant deity, but a provider of justice and a guarantor of their very livelihood. This era introduced a radical new way of managing a nation. Through the establishment of the shugo, military governors, and the jid, land stewards, the shogunate planted the seeds of military administration into every corner of the Japanese countryside. These officials were the eyes and ears of the bakufu, responsible for policing the provinces and collecting taxes, effectively bypassing the traditional imperial administrative channels. However, this new order was inherently unstable, built upon a delicate tension. Japan had entered an era of dual government. The emperor remained the sacred source of all authority, the sun around which the cultural soul of the nation revolved. He was the divine link to the gods, the figurehead whose presence lent legitimacy to every law and every title. But the shogun was the shadow that actually moved across the land. The court held the prestige, but the bakufu held the steel. It was a political tightrope walk. If the shogun ignored the emperor, he risked being seen as a usurper, a man without divine sanction. If the emperor attempted to reclaim political power, he found himself facing a military machine that held the keys to the provinces and the loyalty of the swords. This duality created a strange, bifurcated Japan, a nation with two hearts, one beating with the rhythm of ancient ritual, and the other with the pulse of military might. As the Kamakura period took hold, the social fabric of Japan was being rewoven. The hierarchy was no longer determined by how well one could compose a waka poem or navigate the complexities of court etiquette, but by one's position within the military hierarchy. The sword had become the ultimate arbiter of law. The era of the courtier was fading into memory, and the age of the warrior had truly, irrevocably begun. 1274, the Hakata Bay coastline. For decades, the Kamakura Bakufu had been perfecting its grip on the Japanese archipelago. The samurai had become a professional class, their lives defined by the rigid hierarchies of the shogunate and the sacred bonds of vassalage. They were masters of their own domain, confident in their superiority and the traditional rituals of combat. But as the sun rose over the Tsushima Strait, the warriors of Japan were about to face a reality that no amount of training or lineage could have prepared them for. From the horizon emerged a sight that defied everything the samurai understood about warfare. It was not a disorganized band of pirates or a rival clan seeking land. It was the Mongol Empire, the greatest military machine the world had ever seen. Led by commanders under the Great Khan, the Mongol fleets arrived not with the expectation of a duel, but with the intent of total conquest. To the samurai, war was a highly stylized, almost liturgical affair. Combat was an individual pursuit of glory. A warrior would ride out into the open, announce his lineage and his noble ancestry, and challenge a worthy opponent to a single combat. It was a way to win honor, to prove one's worth through the precision of the bow and the grace of the sword. But the Mongols had no interest in the etiquette of the battlefield. When the first waves of Mongol vessels struck the shores of Tsushima and Iki, the samurai were met with a terrifying, impersonal wall of violence. There were no individual challenges. Instead, there was the thunder of coordinated infantry charges, the whistling of massed arrow volleys, and the sudden, devastating roar of gunpowder bombs, primitive but psychologically shattering explosives that sent plumes of smoke and fire across the beachhead. The Mongols fought as a single, cohesive organism. They utilized sophisticated formations, heavy cavalry, and most crucially, a complete disregard for the warrior's way. They did not care for the name of the man they killed. They only cared for the efficiency of the kill. The samurai, caught in the middle of this tactical whirlwind, found their traditional methods rendered obsolete. Their individualistic bravery, once their greatest strength, became a liability against a foe that fought with the cold, mechanical precision of a swarm. The first invasion was a brutal lesson in survival. The defenders were pushed back, bloodied and bewildered, forced to retreat to the hills as the Mongol tide swept through the coastal settlements. Yet, even in the face of this unprecedented onslaught, the spirit of the warrior did not break. It transformed. The shock of the encounter forced a desperate, rapid evolution in Japanese defensive thinking. As the Mongol fleets retreated to wait for the seasons to turn, a sense of existential dread settled over the Kamakura shogunate. The dual government, the delicate balance between the sacred emperor and the steel-willed shogun, was suddenly facing its greatest test. This was no longer a struggle for land or provincial prestige. This was a struggle for the very soul of Japan. The samurai were no longer just defenders of their clans. They were the thin, trembling line standing between their civilization and the crushing weight of a global empire. The testing of their spirit had begun, and the world they knew would never be the same again. 1281, the shores of Hakata Bay. The tension in Japan had reached a fever pitch. The year was 1281, and the horizon was no longer empty. After 7 years of frantic fortification and the construction of a massive stone wall along the coast, the Japanese defenders waited in a state of suspended animation. They were prepared for the slaughter, prepared to die in the name of their clans, yet they were haunted by the memory of the previous invasion. The Mongol fleet was returning, and this time it was not merely a raiding party. It was a massive, armada-scale force of unparalleled magnitude. As the Mongol ships began to clog the coastline, the samurai engaged in a desperate, grinding struggle. This was not the stylized combat of a single duel, but a chaotic, terrifying war of attrition. The Mongols utilized their superior numbers and coordinated tactics to press against the defensive walls, turning the coastal waters into a slaughterhouse. For days, the warriors of the Kamakura shogunate fought with a ferocity born of pure survival. They were fighting not just for honor, but to prevent the total erasure of their culture. But just as the Mongol momentum seemed poised to break the Japanese lines, the heavens themselves seemed to intervene. The sky, once clear, turned a bruised, violent purple. The wind, which had been a mere breeze, transformed into a howling, predatory force. A massive typhoon, a storm of such ferocity that it defied human comprehension, slammed into the coast of Kyushu. To the terrified defenders on the shore, it felt as though the gods had descended in wrath. The massive Mongol vessels, unable to withstand the fury of the ocean, were tossed like mere toys. The ships were smashed against one another, driven into the rocks, and swallowed by the churning, black depths of the sea. In the aftermath of the storm, the survivors of the Mongol fleet were decimated. The invasion had failed. In the eyes of the Japanese people, this was no accident of meteorology. It was divine intervention. They called it the kamikaze, the divine wind. It was a sign that the gods of Japan had risen to protect their land from the encroaching darkness of the Great Khan. However, while the kamikaze had saved the nation, the consequences were both profound and poisonous. In the short term, the victory brought a surge of religious fervor and a temporary reinforcement of the shogunate's legitimacy. The samurai had survived the impossible, and the myth of Japan as a land protected by the divine was etched into the national consciousness. But the victory was a hollow one. The sheer cost of preparing for and fighting two massive invasions had bled the Kamakura shogunate dry. Unlike traditional wars, where a victorious general could seize land and wealth from the conquered, the defense against the Mongols yielded no spoils. There was no new territory to distribute, no tribute to collect, and no plunder to reward the loyal vassals who had bled for the cause. The economic strain was catastrophic. The samurai, whose entire social structure was built upon the acquisition and distribution of land, found themselves broke and disillusioned. The bond between the shogun and his warriors, the very foundation of the Kamakura system, began to fray. The debt of gratitude that the shogunate owed to its defenders could not be paid in gold or soil. The divine wind had preserved the land, but it had inadvertently set the stage for the collapse of the very government that had defended it. The era of Kamakura dominance was beginning to bleed out, leaving a void that would soon be filled by the chaos of civil war. 1333, the Kamakura coastline. The salt spray of the Pacific had long since dried, but the bitter taste of resentment remained. The divine wind had indeed saved Japan from foreign conquest, but it had left the Kamakura shogunate a hollow shell, a ghost of the military power it once commanded. The glory of the defense against the Mongols had been replaced by a crushing, systemic rot. For the samurai class, the math of war had become impossible to balance. In the traditional feudal order, a warrior's loyalty was a transaction, service in exchange for land and sustenance. But the Mongol invasions were defensive wars of survival. There was no conquered territory to carve up, no enemy treasuries to pillage, and no new provinces to grant to the men who had stood most bravely upon the walls of Hakata. The shogunate, tasked with maintaining the defense and rewarding its defenders, found itself in an impossible position. It had asked for everything from its vassals and had nothing to give in return. As the years passed, the economic foundation of the warrior class began to crumble. Small-scale landholders, the very backbone of the Kamakura military, found themselves drowning in debt. To maintain their armor, their horses, and their status, many were forced to borrow from rising merchant classes or surrender their ancestral lands to powerful religious institutions and court nobles. The samurai, once the undisputed masters of the provinces, were slowly becoming a class of impoverished debtors, clinging to the prestige of their names while their stomachs went empty. This economic desperation acted as a catalyst for a more dangerous contagion: internal strife. The unity that had been forged in the fires of the Mongol invasions evaporated, replaced by a toxic landscape of factionalism. The Hojo regents, who held the true reins of power behind the puppet shoguns, grew increasingly autocratic in their attempts to manage the crisis. Their heavy-handedness and their failure to address the grievances of the provincial warrior clans created deep, jagged rifts within the military government. The distinction between loyal vassal and disillusioned rebel became increasingly blurred. In the provinces, local lords began to realize that the central authority in Kamakura was no longer a provider of stability, but a source of instability. The bond of Jiri, the sacred obligation of duty, was being tested by the reality of survival. If the shogunate could not protect the economic interests of its warriors, why should those warriors protect the shogunate? Whispers of rebellion began to move through the mountain passes and coastal villages. Old rivalries between clans, suppressed during the existential threat of the Mongol era, resurfaced with renewed vigor. The political landscape was no longer a unified front, but a fractured mosaic of competing interests. The shogunate was fighting a war on two fronts, one against the mounting poverty of its subjects, and another against the growing resentment of its own elite. The cracks were no longer mere fissures, they were becoming chasms. The Kamakura shogunate, once an unbreakable bastion of martial law, was now a house divided against itself. The very system that had defined the rise of the samurai was now being dismantled by the weight of its own survival. The era of the first shogunate was not ending with a grand, decisive battle, but with a slow, agonizing decay, a prelude to the storm of chaos that was about to tear Japan asunder. 1333, the Kamakura provinces. As the political foundations of the first shogunate crumbled under the weight of debt and resentment, the physical reality of the samurai remained unchanged. They were, first and foremost, instruments of violence. While the halls of power in Kamakura fell into decay, the training grounds and the ritualistic life of the provincial warrior remained a rigorous, almost sacred, constant. To understand the samurai of this era, one must look past the political collapse and into the disciplined, bloody precision of their daily existence. In this period, warfare was not merely a matter of brute force. It was a highly choreographed ritual of status and skill. The combat style of the early Kamakura warrior was defined by the yabusame, mounted archery. To the samurai of this age, the bow was the soul of the warrior. A man's worth was measured not by how he swung a blade in a frantic melee, but by his ability to sit perfectly still upon a galloping horse, breathing in unison with his mount, and releasing a single, lethal arrow into a target moving at high speed. This was Kyujutsu, the art of the bow, and it was deeply intertwined with the spiritual life of the clan. The ritual of combat began long before the first arrow was notched. It began with the meticulous preparation of the yor, the heavy, lamellar armor composed of lacquered iron or leather scales. The donning of armor was a meditative act, a transition from the man of flesh to the man of war. Each cord tied, each plate fitted, served to reinforce the warrior's mental fortification. This was accompanied by the practice of Zen Buddhism and Shinto purification rites. A warrior did not simply prepare to fight, he prepared to die. The concept of memento mori, the constant awareness of one's own mortality, was not a morbid obsession, but a tactical necessity. To accept death before the battle began was to strip the enemy of their greatest weapon, fear. When the ritual gave way to the reality of the battlefield, the combat style was a deadly hybrid. While the bow dominated the long-range engagement, the close-quarters combat relied on the naginata, a polearm with a curved blade that allowed a warrior to keep distance from infantry or strike from horseback. The sword, the iconic katana, was becoming more prevalent, but it was often treated as a secondary weapon of last resort, used once the lines had clashed and the chaos of the melee had begun. Combat was also a theater of individual glory. In the early shogunate era, the concept of ikiben yari, the first spear, or seeking out a named opponent was paramount. A samurai did not seek to hide in a mass of soldiers. He sought to distinguish himself. He would call out his lineage, his name, and his achievements, inviting a duel that would cement his family's honor in the annals of history. This was the paradox of the early warrior, a man bound by a rigid communal duty to his lord, yet driven by an intense, individualistic hunger for renown. As the Kamakura system dissolved, these rituals and styles did not disappear, they intensified. The desperation of the era meant that the discipline of the bow and the precision of the blade were the only things keeping the chaos at bay. The warrior was preparing for a world where the old rules of loyalty were vanishing, leaving only the cold, sharp certainty of the steel in his hand. 1336 Kyoto. As the embers of the Kamakura era cooled, a new power rose from the ashes, not through total dominance but through a precarious, fragile brilliance. Ashikaga Takoji, a man who had mastered the art of shifting loyalties, had carved a new path for the warrior class. He established the Muromachi shogunate, centering his authority in the heart of the nation's cultural capital. This was the dawn of the Ashikaga era, a period defined by a striking paradox, a golden age of unprecedented artistic splendor, blooming in the midst of a deepening political instability. Unlike the rugged, provincial austerity of the Kamakura period, the Ashikaga shogunate sought legitimacy through refinement. The samurai were no longer just provincial enforcers. They were becoming patrons of the arts. In the narrow streets of Muromachi, the warrior's path began to intersect with the poet's brush and the monk's tea ceremony. This was the era when Zen Buddhism profoundly reshaped the samurai psyche. The discipline required for the bow and the blade found a new, quiet expression in the ritualized simplicity of the tea ceremony and the structured elegance of no theater. The warrior was becoming a cultured aristocrat, a man who could navigate the complexities of a political court as deftly as he could navigate a battlefield. Yet beneath this veneer of silk robes and ink paintings, the foundations of the shogunate were built on shifting sands. While the Ashikaga shoguns presided over a cultural renaissance, their actual grip on the provinces was tenuous at best. The central government in Kyoto was often little more than a magnificent shadow, a court of immense prestige but diminishing command. The true power was hemorrhaging away from the shogun and toward the local lords, the emerging daimyo. The Ashikaga relied on a delicate web of alliances, attempting to balance the interests of powerful clans through complex patronage and ritualized hierarchy. But this system required a level of central authority that the shogunate simply could not maintain. As the Ashikaga shoguns focused on the sophisticated politics of the capital, the provinces began to fracture. Local land disputes, once settled by the shogun's decree, were now being resolved by the edge of the sword. The wealth of the land was being diverted into the hands of provincial strongmen who possessed the one thing the shogunate lacked: autonomous military force. This tension created a volatile atmosphere. It was a world of extreme contrasts, the sublime beauty of a Zen rock garden existing mere miles from a village being razed by a local skirmish. The splendor of the Muromachi period was not a distraction from the instability. It was a desperate, beautiful response to it. In a world where political permanence was an illusion, the pursuit of aesthetic perfection became a way to capture something eternal. The Ashikaga shogunate was a house of cards built of gold and lacquer. It fostered a unique, sophisticated warrior identity that merged the martial with the cerebral, but it failed to provide the structural stability required to hold a nation together. The cracks in the foundation were widening, and the political vacuum left by the weakening shogunate was about to be filled by a violence that no amount of cultural refinement could suppress. The stage was set, and the era of the great civil wars was looming on the horizon. 1336, Kyoto. The golden lacquer of the Ashikaga era was still fresh, but the cracks in the foundation were no longer mere whispers. They were becoming chasms. While the shoguns in the capital practiced the tea ceremony and debated the nuances of Zen, a different kind of ritual was being written in the provinces, a ritual of blood, betrayal, and unbridled ambition. This was the onset of the Anin War, a conflict that would not merely challenge the Ashikaga authority, but would systematically dismantle the very concept of a unified Japan. The spark that ignited this conflagration was deceptively small, a question of succession. When the eighth Ashikaga shogun, Yashimasa, failed to clearly designate an heir, the delicate web of alliances that held the nation together began to fray. What started as a localized dispute over who would inherit the shogunate quickly spiraled into a catastrophic proxy war. On one side stood the Hasakawa clan, and on the other, the Yamana. But these were not just two families fighting for a title. They were the gravitational centers for hundreds of provincial lords, each seeing the vacuum of power as an opportunity to settle old scores and expand their own domains. By 1467, the political tension reached its breaking point, and the violence spilled into the very heart of the nation. The streets of Kyoto, once the jewel of Japanese culture and the center of the shogun's refined world, became a killing field. The Anin War was not a war of grand, decisive battlefield maneuvers or sweeping territorial conquests. It was a war of attrition, a grueling urban nightmare of arson, street fighting, and relentless siege warfare. The city of Kyoto, the cradle of the arts that the Ashikaga had so carefully nurtured, began to burn. The magnificent temples, the sprawling estates of the nobility, and the delicate Zen gardens were consumed by flames. For 10 long years, the capital was a landscape of ash and ruin. The refined warrior poet was replaced by the desperate mercenary. The brush was cast aside for the spear and the heavy club. As the fires raged, the central authority of the Ashikaga shogunate evaporated. The shogun remained in his palace, a prisoner of the chaos, presiding over a city that no longer existed. The consequences of the Anin War were profound and irreversible. The conflict effectively broke the back of the central government, proving to every provincial lord that the shogun was powerless to protect them or restrain them. The war did not result in a winner. It resulted in a vacuum. The authority that had once flowed from Kyoto to the furthest reaches of the islands was severed. In its place, a new, more brutal reality emerged. The Anin War was the funeral pyre of the old order. As the smoke cleared over the ruins of Kyoto, the concept of a unified Japan under a single military government died with the city. From these ashes, a new, decentralized, and hyper-violent era was born. The era of the daimyo, the great territorial lords, was no longer a looming threat. It was a reality. The nation was no longer a cohesive state. It was a collection of warring fiefdoms, each vying for survival in a world where might was the only law. The Anin War had set the nation ablaze, and from that fire the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states, would rise. 1467, Kyoto. The fires of the Anin War had not merely burned the capital, they had incinerated the very idea of a central authority. As the embers cooled over the charred ruins of Kyoto, the silence that followed was not one of peace, but of a terrifying, predatory stillness. The old world, governed by the delicate politics of the Ashikaga shogunate and the refined hierarchies of the imperial court, was dead. In its place, a landscape of fractured power emerged, a fractured mosaic of provinces, each a sovereign island in a sea of chaos. This was the dawn of the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states. The transition from the Anin War to the Sengoku period was not a shift in leadership, but a total collapse of the social contract. For centuries, the legitimacy of a ruler flowed from the shogun, who in turn derived it from the emperor. But as the smoke cleared, the provincial lords realized a brutal truth. The shogun could no longer command, and the emperor could no longer rule. Power was no longer a divine right bestowed by lineage. It was a commodity to be seized, held, and defended by the edge of a blade. The map of Japan, once a cohesive tapestry of loyalties, splintered into hundreds of competing domains. The landscape became a chessboard of constant, shifting allegiances. In this new era, the traditional boundaries of loyalty were obliterated. A lord's survival depended not on his adherence to ancient customs, but on his ability to cultivate a private army, fortify his castle, and outmaneuver his neighbors in a relentless cycle of expansion and retaliation. The era was defined by a new, terrifying social phenomenon, Gekkokujo. This concept, meaning the low overcoming the high, became the heartbeat of the Sengoku Jidai. The rigid class structures of the past were being torn asunder. It was no longer enough to be born into greatness. One had to prove it through blood and conquest. Subordinate generals betrayed their masters, ambitious vassals usurped their lords, and even peasants, driven by desperation and the promise of land, rose up to take what they needed by force. The social ladder was being climbed by those with the sharpest steel and the coldest hearts. As the central government retreated into irrelevance, the daimyo, the great territorial lords, emerged as the true architects of the new Japan. These were not merely administrators, they were warlords. They built massive, sophisticated stone fortresses that served as the nerve centers of their domains. They developed complex systems of taxation, irrigation, and castle towns to fuel their war machines. The daimyo were the suns around which their provinces orbited, and their ambitions were limitless. The Sengoku Jidai was a period of unparalleled creativity born from absolute destruction. It was an age of brilliant tacticians, legendary warriors, and devastating innovations. From the development of advanced fortification architecture to the tactical evolution of infantry formations, the very nature of combat was being rewritten in real time. Japan had entered a state of perpetual motion, a violent, beautiful, and bloody race toward a singularity. The question was no longer who would rule Japan, but who would be the last one standing when the fires finally died down. 1467 Kyoto. If the Anin War was the spark that ignited the powder keg, then Gekko-kyujo was the explosion itself. To understand this era, one must understand that the very concept of status had become a death sentence. In the old world, your place in the social hierarchy was your destiny, etched into the annals of lineage and divine right. But in the Sengoku Jidai, lineage was a luxury that the dying could no longer afford. The term Gekko-kyujo, the low overcoming the high, was more than just a social trend. It was a fundamental breaking of the Japanese soul. It was a psychological shift that permeated every level of society. The traditional bond between lord and vassal, a bond once considered sacred and unbreakable under the tenets of early Bushido, was being severed by the cold reality of survival. Loyalty was no longer a moral absolute. It was a strategic variable. If a master was weak, his vassals did not mourn him, they replaced him. We see this phenomenon play out in a terrifying, repetitive cycle across the provinces. A minor retainer, perhaps a man of humble origins who had risen through sheer martial prowess, would find himself commanding a regiment. He would look at his lord, a man whose family had ruled for centuries but who now lacked the coin to pay his soldiers, and he would see not a master but an obstacle. With a single night of betrayal and a well-placed blade, the subordinate would ascend, and the cycle would begin anew. This was the era of the usurper. But Gekko-kyujo was not confined to the halls of the highborn. The tremors of this social upheaval reached down into the very soil of the Japanese countryside. In a desperate bid for autonomy, entire villages rose in rebellion against oppressive tax collectors and local magistrates. These were not organized armies, but desperate, localized outbursts of violence that proved even the most established authority was vulnerable to the collective rage of the disenfranchised. The vertical pillars of society were crumbling, and the debris was being used by the ambitious to build new, more brutal foundations. This era of might makes right created a Darwinian landscape. The weak were not merely defeated, they were erased. Entire clans that had shaped Japanese history for generations vanished from the maps, swallowed by the rising tide of those who were more ruthless, more adaptable, and more willing to abandon the honor of the past for the victory of the present. The meritocracy of the sword had arrived, and it was a brutal, unforgiving judge. In this vacuum of morality, the traditional rules of engagement dissolved. Diplomacy became a mask for deception, and peace treaties were merely pauses to gather strength for the next betrayal. As the old structures collapsed, they left behind a nation in a state of permanent fever. The social order was no longer a ladder to be climbed with dignity. It was a battlefield where the bottom could and would rise up to crush the top. This was the true essence of the Sengoku Jidai, a world where the only constant was change, and the only sin was being too slow to strike. 1477, the provinces of Japan. As the central authority of the Ashikaga shogunate withered into a mere shadow in Kyoto, a new breed of predator emerged from the chaos of Gekkokujo. If the era was defined by the low overcoming the high, then the byproduct of that upheaval was the birth of the daimyo. These were no longer merely provincial governors or appointed administrators. They were warlords in the truest sense, autocratic, independent, and absolute. The vacuum left by the collapsing imperial and shogunal structures was being filled by men who understood a singular, brutal truth. Power in the Sengoku period was not granted by divine decree or ancient lineage, but by the ability to seize and hold territory through sheer, unrelenting force. These rising daimyo began to carve the map of Japan into a jagged mosaic of competing fiefdoms. To a daimyo, a province was not a responsibility to be governed in the name of an emperor. It was a resource to be exploited, a fortress to be fortified, and a base of operations for further conquest. The foundation of this new power rested on the creation of private armies. In the centuries prior, warfare had often been a ritualized affair, a clash of elite clans following established codes of conduct. But the daimyo era demanded something different. They needed scale. They needed volume. To sustain their ambitions, these lords transformed the nature of the Japanese military. They moved away from the singular, heroic duel and toward the mobilization of massed infantry. The daimyo became the architects of professionalized violence. They built sprawling castle towns, jakamachi, which served as the beating hearts of their domains. These were not just residences. They were logistical hubs designed to support a permanent state of mobilization. Within these walls, the daimyo cultivated a direct, personal bond with their vassals. The old, distant connections to the shogunate were replaced by a fierce, localized loyalty. A samurai's world was no longer the vast expanse of Japan. His world was the borders of his lord's domain. To feed these private armies, the daimyo implemented ruthless economic reforms. They bypassed traditional tax structures, implementing direct levies on land and peasants to ensure a constant flow of rice, the lifeblood of the era. This rice was more than food. It was currency, used to pay for weapons, to bribe rival lords, and to maintain the massive standing forces required to defend their borders. The daimyo turned their domains into highly efficient war machines, where every farmer was a potential supplier for the front lines, and every village was a cog in the machinery of conquest. This was the era of the great lords, men who functioned as sovereign kings within their own borders. They built massive stone fortifications that defied the landscape, creating visual symbols of their permanence in an era of constant flux. They established their own laws, their own currencies, and their own justice. The rise of the daimyo meant that Japan was no longer a nation, but a collection of warring states, each led by a master of survival who understood that in the Sengoku Jidai, the only way to avoid being the prey was to become the ultimate predator. The age of the warrior administrator was dead. The age of the warlord had begun. 1543, Tanegashima Island. For centuries, the art of war in Japan had been a symphony of steel, defined by the rhythmic clash of blades and the thunderous charge of cavalry. A samurai's prowess was measured by his mastery of the bow, his skill with the spear, and the legendary sharpness of his katana. Combat was intimate, personal, and deeply rooted in the individual martial excellence of the warrior. But in a single, transformative moment on a small southern island, the trajectory of Japanese history was irrevocably altered. A Chinese junk, blown off course by storms, drifted toward the shores of Tanegashima. On board were Portuguese traders, and with them, a weapon that would shatter the traditional foundations of the Sengoku period, the matchlock musket. When the first of these Tanegashima firearms were presented to the local lord, they were viewed as curiosities, exotic trinkets of a distant land. But the Japanese, ever perceptive and driven by a desperate need for military advantage, quickly saw past the novelty. They did not merely observe the weapon, they deconstructed it. Local blacksmiths, masters of metallurgy, began to replicate the mechanism, refining the design to suit the unique needs of Japanese warfare. Within a generation, the arquebus was no longer a foreign interloper. It was a staple of the Japanese arsenal. The impact of the matchlock was nothing short of revolutionary. It democratized lethality. In the old paradigm, a battlefield was dominated by the elite, the highly trained samurai who had spent a lifetime perfecting the arts of killing. A single master swordsman could hold a line against multiple opponents, but the musket changed the math of slaughter. A peasant with only weeks of training could now pull a trigger and strike down a seasoned, high-ranking commander from a distance. The heroic duel, once the centerpiece of engagement, was suddenly vulnerable to a lead ball traveling faster than the eye could follow. As the technology spread, the tactical landscape of Japan underwent a violent metamorphosis. The daimyo, ever the predators, realized that the musket demanded a new kind of organization. The era of the solitary, galloping horseman was giving way to the era of the disciplined infantry block. To maximize the effectiveness of firearms, armies had to be restructured into massive formations of ashigaru, foot soldiers, who could fire in synchronized volleys. This was the birth of volley fire, a terrifying, rolling wave of gunpowder smoke and projectile death that could sweep across a field, breaking even the most courageous cavalry charge. This shift in technology necessitated a shift in logistics and architecture. Castles were no longer just symbols of prestige. They became complex defensive systems designed to withstand gunpowder bombardment and to provide elevated platforms for musketeers. The sheer cost of producing firearms, gunpowder, and lead also reinforced the power of the great daimyo. Only the wealthiest lords could afford to equip thousands of men with the new tools of death, further widening the gap between the powerful warlords and the minor provincial clans. The introduction of the matchlock did not make the sword obsolete, but it stripped it of its absolute supremacy. The katana remained the soul of the samurai, but the musket became the hand of the warlord. As the smoke cleared from the battlefields of the mid-16th century, it was clear that the rules of engagement had been rewritten. The age of individual martial glory was being eclipsed by the age of industrial-scale warfare, setting the stage for the rise of the great unifiers who would master this new, violent science. 1560, Okezama. While much of Japan was still grappling with the implications of gunpowder, one man was already using it to rewrite the very definition of power. If the matchlock was the tool that changed the math of slaughter, then Oda Nobunaga was the mathematician who realized that, with enough fire and blood, he could solve the equation of a fractured nation. Nobunaga was not your typical daimyo. In his youth, he was dismissed by his peers as the fool of Owari, a man of unpredictable temperament and eccentric habits. But beneath the veneer of a social outcast lay a mind that was terrifyingly modern. Where other lords clung to the ancient traditions of chivalry and the personal honor of the warrior, Nobunaga looked toward the horizon. He saw a Japan that was not a collection of honorable clans, but a chaotic machine that required a singular, iron will to operate. His ascent began in earnest at the Battle of Okayama. Facing an army that vastly outnumbered his own, Nobunaga did not rely on a traditional head-on cavalry charge. Instead, he utilized the element of surprise and the terrain, striking the heart of the Imagawa clan with a ferocity that shocked the provinces. It was a victory that signaled more than just a tactical success. It signaled the arrival of a new kind of predator. Nobunaga's genius lay in his ability to marry the old world of the samurai to the new world of industrial warfare. He was among the first to truly grasp the logistical potential of the arquebus. He didn't just arm his men, he revolutionized their training. He organized his ashigaru into disciplined units capable of the rotating volley fire that would later become his trademark. At the Battle of Nagashino, this reached its terrifying zenith. Facing the legendary Taikta cavalry, the most feared horsemen in Japan, Nobunaga utilized rotating lines of musketeers behind wooden palisades. The charge of the elite was not met with a clash of blades, but with a relentless, mechanical wall of lead. The age of the heroic cavalryman died in the smoke of Nobunaga's gunners. But Nobunaga's ambition extended far beyond the battlefield. He sought to break the very foundations of the old order. He understood that to unify Japan, he had to dismantle the power of the religious institutions that rivaled the state. His campaign against the militant Buddhist sects of Mount Hiei was nothing short of apocalyptic. When the monks of Enryakuji refused to submit to his authority, Nobunaga did not negotiate. He burned. He razed temples, slaughtered thousands, and showed a callous disregard for the sacred that earned him his most chilling moniker, Darokuten Mao, the demon king of the sixth heaven. To his enemies, he was a monster, a man without honor who replaced the soul of the samurai with the cold efficiency of the machine. But to those who saw the chaos of the Sengoku period, he was something else, a force of nature. He was tearing down a broken system to build something new. Nobunaga was not interested in the poetic beauty of the sword. He was interested in the absolute consolidation of power. He was the storm that cleared the path, a man whose terrifying ambition would set the stage for the final unification of Japan, leaving behind a trail of ash and a legacy that would haunt the samurai class forever. 1582 Honnōji. The storm that was Oda Nobunaga had reached its violent crescendo, not at the hands of a rival warlord, but through the treachery of his own general, Akechi Mitsuhide. In the roaring flames of the Honnōji temple, the demon king met his end, leaving his vast, fractured empire in a state of sudden, terrifying vacuum. The machine Nobunaga had built was broken, and as the smoke cleared over Kyoto, the question was no longer how to conquer Japan, but who would be left to hold the pieces together. The answer did not come from a high-born daimyo or a prestigious bloodline. It came from a man whose very existence challenged the fundamental structure of Japanese society. Toyotomi Hideyoshi was a man born of the earth, not of the sword. In the rigid hierarchy of the Sengoku period, he should have remained a footnote in history, a nameless peasant, a foot soldier, perhaps a lowly servant. Yet Hideyoshi possessed a quality that even the most decorated samurai lacked, a terrifying, mercurial intelligence and an almost supernatural ability to navigate the shifting tides of human ambition. His rise was not fueled by the thunder of muskets, but by the subtle art of the impossible. While Nobunaga had conquered through destruction, Hideyoshi conquered through construction. He was the master of the golden tea room, a man who understood that politics was a game played as much with silk and ceremony as it was with steel. He climbed the ladder of Nobunaga's service not through lineage, but through sheer utility. He was the negotiator, the diplomat, the man who could turn a siege into a surrender without spilling a single drop of blood. Legend tells of his siege of Takamatsu, where, instead of a bloody assault, he built massive dikes to flood the enemy castle, essentially drowning the opposition under the weight of his ingenuity. When Nobunaga fell, Hideyoshi moved with the predatory speed of a man who knew that hesitation was death. He struck down the traitor Akechi Mitsuhide with lightning ferocity, legitimizing his claim to Nobunaga's mantle. But Hideyoshi knew that to truly unify Japan, he could not merely be a conqueror. He had to be a stabilizer. He began a campaign of unprecedented scale, sweeping through the provinces to subdue the remaining daimyo. From the Shikoku campaign to the conquest of Kyushu, Hideyoshi's momentum seemed unstoppable. He was a master of logistics, ensuring his armies were fed and moved with a precision that matched Nobunaga's firepower. However, his greatest legacy was not found on the battlefield, but in the social engineering he used to ensure peace. He understood that the chaos of the Sengoku period was fueled by the fluidity of class, the fact that a peasant could become a lord. To prevent another era of civil war, he initiated the sword hunt. He stripped the peasantry of their weapons, strictly separating the farmer from the warrior. By codifying the social hierarchy, he effectively froze the class system in place. Hideyoshi had risen from the mud to the heights of unimaginable power, but in doing so, he slammed the door shut behind him. He had unified the nation, but he had also ensured that the path he climbed would be closed to all who followed. The peasant had become the unifier, and in his wake, the era of the social climber was over, replaced by the rigid, unyielding order of the samurai state. 1588 Kyoto. The air in the capital was heavy, not with the smoke of battle, but with the suffocating weight of a new, inescapable order. For over a century, the Sengoku period had been a whirlwind of social upheaval. It was a time of Gekko-kyujo, the low overcoming the high. In this era of chaos, a peasant could pick up a spear, kill a master, and rise to become a lord. While this mobility had fueled the fires of war, Toyotomi Hideyoshi realized it was also the very thing making peace impossible. As long as any farmer could arm himself, any rebellion could spark a wildfire, and any minor skirmish could escalate into a revolution. To stabilize his new Japan, Hideyoshi realized he had to perform a surgical strike on the very fabric of society. He didn't need to kill his enemies. He needed to strip them of their ability to resist. The decree was issued, the Katnagari, or the Great Sword Hunt. It was an administrative onslaught that swept across the provinces like a seasonal storm. Hideyoshi's officials moved through the countryside with unrelenting precision, descending upon villages and hamlets. Their mission was absolute: find every blade, every spear, every bow, and every weapon of war and confiscate them. Imagine the scene in the rural heartlands. For generations, families had kept blades not just for defense, but as tools, as heirlooms, as symbols of their ability to protect their land. Now, the tax collectors and soldiers arrived to take them away. The peasantry, who had lived through decades of seeing weapons as the only currency of survival, were forced to watch as their means of agency were gathered into massive piles and melted down. But this was more than a mere disarmament. It was a profound social amputation. Hideyoshi was not just taking their steel, he was taking their identity. By separating the tools of war from the hands of the tillers, he was drawing a line in the dirt that could never be crossed again. He established a rigid, two-tiered world. On one side were the farmers, the producers, the backbone of the economy, who were commanded to stay in the fields and keep their hands stained with soil, never with blood. On the other side were the samurai, the professional warrior class, who were granted the exclusive right to carry the two swords, the long katana and the short wakizashi. This decree effectively froze Japanese society in place. The fluidity that had allowed Hideyoshi himself to rise from nothing was systematically dismantled. The social climber was outlawed. If you were born a peasant, you would die a peasant. If you were born a warrior, you were destined for the blade. By stripping the common man of his weapons, Hideyoshi achieved a masterstroke of psychological warfare. He removed the possibility of spontaneous uprising, turning the volatile energy of the provinces into a predictable, manageable machine. He had traded the chaotic freedom of the Sengoku period for a structured, ironclad stability. The era of the warrior peasant was dead. In its place, a new, stratified Japan was being born, a nation where your place in the world was determined not by your merit or your courage, but by the blood in your veins and the permission of the state. The sword no longer belonged to the man who could wield it. It belonged only to those who were born to carry it. 1590, Odawara. While the sword hunt had severed the connection between the peasant and the blade, a final, massive obstacle remained to Hideyoshi's dream of a unified Japan. To the east, the Hojo clan sat entrenched within the formidable walls of Odawara Castle. For generations, the Hojo had been the masters of the Kanto Plain, a dynasty of legendary resilience that had weathered countless storms. Their fortress was not merely a castle. It was a mountain of stone and timber, a symbol of defiance against any who dared claim the title of unifier. For Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the Hojo were the last great knot in the thread of his conquest. As long as they remained independent, his peace was an illusion, a fragile peace that stopped at the borders of their domain. The response from Hideyoshi was not a mere military campaign. It was a display of overwhelming, crushing logistics. He did not just march an army, he moved a civilization. To surround Odawara, Hideyoshi mobilized a force of staggering proportions. Estimates suggest upwards of 200,000 men. This was an army of armies, a mosaic of daimyo, provincial lords, and specialized units drawn from every corner of the newly stratified Japan. As the massive host descended upon the Kanto region, the sheer scale of the mobilization served a dual purpose. It was intended to break the Hojo, yes, but it was also a demonstration to every other daimyo in the land. Hideyoshi was showing them the cost of defiance. He was proving that the era of private wars and local autonomy was over. The era of the state had arrived. The siege itself was a masterclass in psychological and economic strangulation. Rather than launching a suicidal frontal assault against the Hojo's legendary defenses, Hideyoshi chose to encircle them. He built a massive, temporary city around the castle, a sprawling encampment that housed his vast army and their endless supplies. The siege became a spectacle of abundance amidst the Hojo's growing scarcity. While the defenders inside the walls began to feel the slow, agonizing squeeze of starvation, The besiegers lived in a city of tents, organized with the cold efficiency of a burgeoning bureaucracy. Hideyoshi's brilliance lay in his patience. He understood that the sword could conquer a castle, but logistics could conquer a nation. He utilized the very structures he had built during the sword hunt, the rigid hierarchies, and the disciplined soldier class, to maintain a blockade that was as unyielding as iron. Slowly, the spirit of the Hojo began to fracture. The realization dawned upon them that no relief force was coming, and no amount of ancestral pride could fill empty stomachs. The siege was not won by a single, heroic charge of cavalry, but by the relentless, grinding pressure of a unified system. When the Hojo finally surrendered, it marked more than just the fall of a castle. It marked the end of the Sengoku era's true fragmentation. With the Kanto plain brought under his heel, Hideyoshi had achieved what no ruler had managed in a century. He had consolidated the map. The disparate pieces of Japan were no longer warring states. They were provinces of a single, centralized authority. The siege of Odawara was the final nail in the coffin of chaos, cementing the transition from the age of the wandering warrior to the age of the organized state. October 21, 1600, Sekigahara. But the peace forged by Toyotomi Hideyoshi was a house built upon sand. When the great unifier breathed his last in 1598, he left behind a vacuum of power so profound it threatened to pull the entire nation back into the abyss of civil war. The delicate balance he had maintained between the great daimyo was gone, replaced by a simmering tension that could only be resolved by a single, catastrophic collision. On one side stood Tokugawa Ieyasu, the elder statesman of the Sengoku period, a man of calculated patience and immense political cunning. He represented the old guard, the architects of order, and the vision of a stable, centralized shogunate. On the other side stood the Western Army, a coalition of loyalists to the Toyotomi clan, led by the brilliant but mercurial Ishida Mitsunari. To them, Ieyasu was not a peacemaker, but a usurper, a predator waiting for the scent of death to claim a throne that did not belong to him. As the two massive armies converged upon the fog-shrouded valley of Sekigahara, the air itself seemed to thicken with the weight of destiny. This was no longer a mere skirmish over provincial borders. This was the end game. It was the moment where the future of the Japanese soul would be decided. When the order to charge finally broke the morning silence, the valley exploded into a nightmare of steel, smoke, and screams. The roar of matchlock muskets tore through the mist, punctuated by the rhythmic, thunderous beat of war drums. Thousands of samurai, clad in lacquered armor and bearing the crests of their ancestors, threw themselves into a meat grinder of coordinated violence. The clash of spears and the flash of katana blades created a chaotic symphony of death. For hours, the battle was a stalemate of brutal attrition. The Western Army held the high ground, and for a moment, it appeared that Mitsunari's coalition might hold the line and shatter Ieyasu's ambitions. The fog clung to the valley floor, obscuring the movements of commanders and turning the battlefield into a labyrinth of confusion where a man might find glory or death in a single heartbeat. But Sekigahara was not won by courage alone. It was won by betrayal. In the heat of the struggle, the turning point arrived not from a frontal assault, but from a sudden, chilling shift in allegiance. Kobayakawa Hideaki, a young daimyo positioned on a strategic hillside with a significant force, had remained indecisive, watching the slaughter from above. His hesitation was the fulcrum upon which the fate of Japan turned. When Ieyasu, in a desperate gamble, ordered his arquebusiers to fire upon Kobayakawa's own position to provoke a decision. The young lord finally moved. But he did not move to aid the Western army. He charged down the slope, turning his blades against his own allies. The betrayal sent a shockwave through the Western lines. The coalition, already strained by suspicion and conflicting loyalties, buckled and broke. The disciplined ranks dissolved into a panicked rout. The ultimate showdown ended not with a dignified surrender, but with a frantic slaughter in the mud. As the sun set over the blood-soaked valley, the smoke cleared to reveal a new reality. The era of the Toyotomi was dead. The chaos of the Sengoku period was finally extinguished. From the carnage of Sekigahara, a new sun was rising, the Tokugawa shogunate, a regime that would govern Japan for over 2.5 centuries of absolute peace. March 24, 1603, Edo. The blood of Sekigahara had long since dried into the soil of central Japan, but the tremors of that singular day were still vibrating through the bones of the nation. The era of Gekko-kyujo, the low overcoming the high, had defined the Japanese psyche for over a century. It was a time when a peasant could become a lord, and a lord could be butchered in his sleep by a subordinate. But as Tokugawa Ieyasu sat in his fortified seat in Edo, the air was no longer thick with the scent of gunpowder and desperation. It was thick with the scent of something far more rare in this land: permanence. With the formal appointment of Ieyasu as shogun by the emperor, the gears of history shifted. The chaotic, swirling currents of the Sengoku period were being channeled into a singular, unstoppable force. This was the Tokugawa dawn. It was not merely a change in leadership. It was a fundamental restructuring of the Japanese soul. Ieyasu understood what his predecessors had failed to grasp, that a nation forged in fire cannot be governed by the sword alone. To prevent the fires from reigniting, he would need to build a cage of law, tradition, and rigid hierarchy. He did not just want to conquer the daimyo, he wanted to domesticate them. The transition was surgical. The great unifiers before him, Nobunaga with his terror and Hideyoshi with his ambition, had broken the old world, but they had failed to build a new one that could endure. They had ruled through the momentum of conquest. Ieyasu, however, ruled through the momentum of stability. He began the monumental task of moving the center of gravity away from the ancient, aristocratic courts of Kyoto and toward the marshy, developing plains of Edo. Under the new Tokugawa order, the samurai underwent a metamorphosis that was as profound as it was unsettling. For generations, their identity had been defined by the battlefield, by the sharpness of their steel and the bravery of their charge. But in this new dawn, the battlefield was being replaced by the bureaucracy. The daimyo were no longer independent warlords roaming a fractured landscape. They were now high-ranking officials within a centralized machine, required to spend alternating years in Edo to serve as hostages to the shogun's peace. The great wars were not simply over, they were being systematically dismantled. The weapons of war, the matchlock muskets and the heavy cavalry, were being relegated to the background of a society that now prioritized lineage, protocol, and administrative precision. The sword, once a tool of survival, began its slow transformation into a symbol of status, a soul encased in scabbard, worn by men who would increasingly spend more time with ink brushes than with bloodied blades. As the sun rose over the newly established capital of Edo, the smoke of the Sengoku era finally drifted away. A profound, heavy stillness settled over the islands. The age of the warrior was ending, and the age of the statesman was beginning. The Tokugawa dawn had arrived, bringing with it a peace so absolute and so long-lasting that it would fundamentally redefine what it meant to be a samurai forever. 1603, Edo. The marshy, unassuming settlement that had once been a mere fishing village was now the beating heart of a new Japan. As the Tokugawa shogunate solidified its grip, Edo began its meteoric ascent from a frontier outpost to one of the most sophisticated, sprawling, and densely populated metropolises on the planet. This was the architecture of order. Where once there had been scorched earth and fortified mountain castles, there were now wide boulevards, canals, and the massive, formidable walls of Edo Castle, a sprawling monument to the shogun's absolute authority. But the true transformation of Edo was not found merely in its timber and stone, but in its atmosphere. The frantic, kinetic energy of the warring states had been replaced by a profound, rhythmic stability. This was the Pax Tokugawa, a peace so deeply enforced that it felt less like a treaty and more like a law of nature. In this new capital, the geography itself was a map of social control. The city was meticulously partitioned. The center was reserved for the shogun and his direct vassals, creating a core of unshakable power. Surrounding them were the districts of the daimyo, their residences serving as constant, gilded reminders of their subservience. Beyond the warrior class lay the merchant quarters and the commoner districts, creating a layered urban landscape where every person, from the highest lord to the lowliest street vendor, had a prescribed place in the cosmic order. This order was enforced by a system of breathtaking complexity. The shogunate did not just rule through fear, it ruled through presence. The policy of sankinkatai, or alternate attendance, became the engine of Edo's growth. To ensure their loyalty, the daimyo were forced to travel to Edo every other year, bringing with them massive, colorful processions of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of retainers. This constant flow of wealth, culture, and people turned Edo into a melting pot of provincial traditions, a vibrant hub where the entire nation's resources were funneled into a single, controlled point. For the samurai, life in Edo was a study in contradictions. The city was a gilded cage. They were the elite, the masters of the social hierarchy, yet they were increasingly tethered to the shogun's administrative machine. The grand, sweeping campaigns of their ancestors were replaced by the meticulous management of taxes, the drafting of legal codes, and the maintenance of public works. The chaos of the battlefield had been traded for the precision of the ledger. Yet in this stillness, a new kind of culture began to bloom. Because the threat of sudden death had receded, the samurai and the urban classes turned their energies toward the refinement of the self. The martial arts did not vanish, but they became stylized, transformed into disciplined paths of spiritual and physical perfection rather than mere methods of slaughter. Poetry, tea ceremonies, and Neo-Confucian philosophy began to weave themselves into the fabric of the warrior's identity. Edo became a city of spectacle and ceremony, a place where the sharpening of a blade was less important than the etiquette of a bow. It was a capital built on the paradox of the warrior bureaucrat, a society maintained by the threat of the sword but governed by the grace of the brush. The great capital of peace had arrived, and in its shadow, the samurai would enter their most stable, yet most transformative chapter. 1603, Edo. If Edo was the heart of this new Japan, then the social hierarchy was its skeletal structure, unyielding, rigid, and designed to prevent any movement that might threaten the stability of the whole. To understand the Pax Tokugawa, One must understand that peace was not merely the absence of war. It was the enforcement of a strict, vertical architecture of human existence. Under the guidance of Neo-Confucian philosophy, the Tokugawa shogunate codified a four-tiered class system, known as Shinokosho, a social ladder that sought to freeze time and status in place. At the apex of this pyramid sat the samurai. They were the only class permitted to carry the daisho, the pair of swords that served as both their soul and their legal badge of office. To be a samurai was to exist in a realm of privilege, but it was a privilege defined by duty. They were the moral compass of the nation, the administrators of the law, and the sole legitimate keepers of violence. In this era of peace, their status was no longer measured by the blood they spilled on the battlefield, but by the purity of their lineage and the precision of their conduct. They were the masters of the realm, yet they were also its most heavily regulated subjects. Below the warriors sat the peasants, or namen. In the eyes of the shogunate, the farmer occupied a position of paradoxical importance. They were the backbone of the economy, the producers of the rice that fueled the entire nation and paid the stipends of the samurai. Because they provided the literal sustenance of the state, they were theoretically ranked higher than the merchants. However, this status was a heavy one. Their lives were defined by grueling labor, heavy taxation, and a lack of mobility. They were tied to the land, their lives dictated by the seasons and the strict dictates of the local daimyo. They were essential, yet they were kept at a distance, viewed as the foundational layer upon which the elegance of the upper classes rested. Further down the hierarchy were the artisans, or kagyo. These were the craftsmen, the blacksmiths, the carpenters, the weavers, who transformed raw materials into the tools and luxuries of Japanese life. They possessed specialized skills that were vital to the functioning of a sophisticated urban society, yet they occupied a lower social rung because they did not produce the primary wealth of the land. They lived in the bustling streets of the growing cities, contributing to the material richness of the era, yet they remained socially subordinate to the producers of food. Finally, at the very bottom of this social order were the merchants, or shonen. To the Confucian mind, the merchant was a parasite, someone who gained wealth not through labor or production, but by moving the goods created by others. They were viewed with profound suspicion, seen as a class that could potentially destabilize the social order through the accumulation of liquid wealth. Yet, herein lies the great irony of the Edo period. While the merchants were legally and socially the lowest of the low, their mastery of trade and commerce meant that, as the cities grew, they often became the de facto masters of the economy. This hierarchy was more than a social convention, it was a divine mandate. To challenge one station was to challenge the cosmic order itself. In this meticulously crafted world, every individual knew their place, their purpose, and their limits. The samurai stood at the top, looking down upon a world of structured service, holding the sword that kept the entire machine in motion. 1603. Edo. But as the decades of the Tokugawa era unfolded, a profound and unsettling paradox began to take hold within the very class that sat atop the social pyramid. The swords that had once been instruments of survival and conquest were becoming, increasingly, relics of a bygone age. For a warrior class defined by the art of death, the arrival of a permanent, unbroken peace was a crisis of identity. In the Sengoku period, a samurai's worth was measured in his prowess on the battlefield, his ability to strike with precision, to hold a line, and to command through sheer martial presence. But in the Pax Tokugawa there were no battlefields. There were no rival daimyo to overthrow, no campaigns to lead, and no glory to be won through the edge of a blade. The great engines of war had been silenced, replaced by the rhythmic, administrative pulse of a massive, centralized state. As the shogunate consolidated its grip on Japan, the role of the samurai underwent a radical, fundamental metamorphosis. The warrior was being forced to evolve, or risk becoming obsolete. To serve the shogun in this new era did not mean leading a cavalry charge. It meant managing a ledger. It meant overseeing irrigation projects, collecting rice taxes, regulating urban commerce, and navigating the labyrinthine complexities of local law. The transition was profound. The sword was being exchanged for the pen. The samurai was becoming a bureaucrat. The skills that had once been honed in the dojo, discipline, focus, and unwavering loyalty, were being redirected toward the desk and the scroll. The martial arts were no longer strictly practical tools for combat. They were becoming ritualized disciplines, a way to preserve the spirit of the warrior even when the utility of the warrior had vanished. Combat training shifted from the necessity of survival to the pursuit of character, a way to maintain the dignity of their station in a world that no longer required their violence. This new class of scholar warriors was tasked with the monumental job of running a nation. They became the accountants of the rice economy, the judges of the provincial courts, and the architects of social order. They studied Neo-Confucianism not just as a philosophy, but as a manual for governance. To be a high-ranking samurai now meant possessing a sophisticated understanding of ethics, administration, and literature. The elegance of their conduct was no longer just a social grace. It was a requirement of their office. Yet this transformation carried a hidden, corrosive cost. As the samurai moved from the battlefield to the bureaucracy, the relationship between their status and their reality began to fray. While their social prestige remained at the zenith of the hierarchy, their economic foundation was shifting. They were paid in fixed stipends of rice, a currency that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage in a growing, commercialized economy. The warrior was becoming a salaried official, tethered to the whims of a market they were taught to despise. They held the highest status, yet they were increasingly caught in a web of debt and diminishing returns. The pen could manage the state, but it could not stop the slow, quiet erosion of the warrior's traditional power. The era of the soldier was over. The era of the administrator had begun. 1633. Edo. As the internal machinery of the Tokugawa state began to hum with the efficiency of a bureaucratic machine, a new and even more profound anxiety gripped the shogunate, the fear of the outside world. For centuries, Japan had been a nation of porous borders, a crossroads where traders, monks, and adventurers brought not only silks and spices, but also something far more volatile: new ideas, foreign religions, and the disruptive influence of Western powers. To the Tokugawa shogunate, this fluidity was a threat to the very foundation of the social order they had fought so hard to build. They saw the spread of Christianity not merely as a religious movement, but as a subversive political force that demanded a loyalty higher than that owed to the shogun. A foreign god was a direct competitor to the absolute authority of the Tokugawa. Furthermore, the presence of European merchants and missionaries brought the shadow of colonial expansionism, a specter that haunted the halls of Edo Castle. If Japan were to remain a stable, stratified society, the shogunate reasoned, it had to be a closed society. Thus, through a series of increasingly stringent edicts, the policy of Sakoku, the locked country, was born. This was not a sudden slamming of a door, but a deliberate, systematic tightening of the screws. The decrees were absolute and uncompromising. Japanese citizens were forbidden from leaving the country under pain of death, and those who had traveled abroad were prohibited from returning on pain of execution. The very concept of foreign travel became a capital offense. The shogunate sought to sever the arteries of international influence, creating a vacuum of isolation intended to preserve the purity of Japanese tradition and the stability of the shogunate's rule. But Sakoku was not a policy of total darkness. It was a policy of controlled light. The shogunate did not seek to vanish from the world but to curate its contact with it. They established a single, highly regulated gateway, the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki Harbor. Here, the Dutch, the only Europeans permitted to remain, were confined to a tiny, walled enclave. They were allowed to trade, but only under the watchful eyes of shogunate officials. Through this narrow aperture, a trickle of knowledge escaped the vacuum. Through the Dutch, the samurai bureaucrats gained access to rangaku, or Dutch learning. They studied Western medicine, astronomy, and geography, absorbing the science of the West while strictly rejecting its soul. For over 2 centuries, this policy succeeded beyond the shogunate's wildest dreams. Japan became a laboratory of stability, a nation frozen in a state of exquisite, controlled perfection. The borders were silent. The seas were calm. Within this cocoon, the culture of the Edo period flourished, reaching heights of artistic and philosophical sophistication that would have been impossible in a time of constant external flux. Yet beneath this surface of tranquil isolation, the world was changing. While the samurai studied their scrolls and managed their rice stipends in a vacuum, the rest of the globe was undergoing a violent, industrial metamorphosis. The locked country was growing increasingly disconnected from the accelerating pulse of human history. The walls of Sakoku provided a sense of security, but they also created a profound vulnerability. The shogunate had successfully frozen time, but they had forgotten that time, eventually, always finds a way to break through. 1800. Edo. The silence of the Pax Tokugawa, once a source of pride, had begun to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a shroud. For over 200 years, the samurai had lived within a meticulously crafted social equilibrium, a world where every man knew his place and every movement was dictated by the rigid hierarchies of the Tokugawa state. But as the decades bled into centuries, the very stability that had ensured their survival began to erode the very essence of what it meant to be a warrior. The fundamental crisis was one of identity. The samurai were defined by conflict, by the necessity of the blade, the urgency of the battlefield, and the constant demand for martial excellence. But in a nation where peace was not merely a goal, but a permanent, enforced reality, the samurai had become a class of soldiers with no war to fight. The sword, once the soul of the warrior, had transitioned from a tool of life and death into a ceremonial ornament, a heavy piece of steel worn to signify a status that no longer required its use. As the martial necessity faded, the samurai were forced into the halls of government. They became clerks, tax collectors, accountants, and scholars. They traded the rugged discipline of the training ground for the meticulous tedium of the brush and the ledger. This transition from warrior to bureaucrat was not merely a change in occupation. It was a slow, agonizing death of the spirit. The Bushido Code, built upon the foundations of courage, loyalty, and combat, found itself increasingly incongruous with the daily life of a man whose greatest challenge was the accurate recording of grain shipments. This loss of purpose was compounded by a crushing economic reality. The Tokugawa social structure was built upon a rigid feudal foundation. The samurai were the elite, yet they were paid not in gold or silver, but in stipends of rice. This system, designed for a wartime economy, was utterly ill-equipped for the burgeoning commercialism of the Edo period. As merchants and traders flourished in the cities, accumulating vast wealth through the growing market economy, the samurai remained tethered to a stagnant, land-based system of compensation. The math of survival was becoming impossible. As the cost of living in the urban centers rose, the value of a fixed rice stipend plummeted. Families of one-sprout lineage found themselves drowning in debt to the very merchant class they were socially instructed to despise. High-ranking lords and low-ranking foot soldiers alike faced the same creeping indignity, the inability to maintain the lifestyle their status demanded. To bridge the gap, many samurai were forced into secondary trades, crafting umbrellas, making lanterns, or tutoring, activities that were viewed as deeply shameful for a man of the sword. By the early 19th century, the samurai class was a paradox. They held the highest social prestige in Japan, yet they were increasingly impoverished, disillusioned, and adrift. They were a caste of ghosts, haunting a society that had outgrown the need for their primary function. The pride of the warrior was being hollowed out by the ledger of the merchant, and the discipline of the blade was being replaced by the desperation of the debtor. The internal rot was profound, a slow decay of tradition and purpose that left the entire social edifice brittle, waiting for a single, external shock to shatter it forever. July 8, 1853, Uraga Harbor. The internal decay of the Tokugawa shogunate was a quiet, creeping thing, but the shock that followed was anything but silent. As the sun rose over the Sagami Bay, the horizon did not bring the usual sight of wooden fishing vessels or the familiar silhouettes of coastal junks. Instead, emerging from the morning mist like leviathans from a dark myth, came a fleet of massive, coal-burning, steam-powered warships. These were the Black Ships, the Kurofune. Led by Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy, these vessels were ironclad, smoke-belching monsters of industrial warfare. To the Japanese observers on the shore, they were an impossibility. They were a terrifying glimpse into a world that had moved forward while Japan had stood still. For over 2 centuries, the policy of Sakoku, the closed country, had acted as a shield, protecting the shogunate's order from the perceived chaos of the West. But as the soot from Perry's engines stained the pristine waters of Uraga, it became clear that the shield had become a cage. The arrival of the Black Ships was not merely a diplomatic encounter, it was a psychological assault. The shogunate, the very institution that had maintained the Pax Tokugawa, found itself paralyzed. They possessed the prestige of the samurai, the tradition of the blade, and a rigid social hierarchy, but they possessed none of the technology required to face the tide of modernity. The steam engines, the heavy cannons, and the sheer scale of the American vessels made the samurai's katana look like a relic of a forgotten age. Perry did not come to ask, he came to demand. He presented the shogunate with an ultimatum: open the ports, establish trade, and end the isolation that had defined Japan for generations. The shogunate's response was a desperate, frantic attempt to maintain face, but the cracks in their authority were now wide enough to see through. The decision to eventually sign the Treaty of Kanagawa signaled the end of Japan's era of seclusion. It was the moment the dam finally broke. The political fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The shogunate's inability to repel the barbarians was seen by many as a betrayal of the highest order. To the samurai, the shogun's primary duty was the defense of the realm, and his failure to do so struck at the very heart of his legitimacy. The humiliation of the black ships acted as a lightning rod, channeling the long-simmering resentment of the impoverished and disillusioned warrior class into a singular, burning purpose. A new faction began to coalesce in the shadows of the crumbling bureaucracy. These were not the stagnant clerks of the Edo administration, but younger, more radical samurai, men who saw the weakness of the shogunate and recognized that if Japan were to survive the encroaching West, it would have to change or be conquered. They began to chant a slogan that would soon set the nation on fire: Sano Joy. Revere the emperor, expel the barbarian. The black ships had done more than just demand trade. They had shattered the illusion of Tokugawa invincibility. They had brought the 20th century to the doorstep of a 14th century warrior culture. The era of isolation was dead, and in its place, a violent, transformative storm was gathering. The samurai were no longer just fighting for their stipends or their status. They were about to fight for the very soul of Japan. January 3, 1868, Kyoto. The storm that had been gathering since the arrival of the black ships finally broke, not with a whimper, but with the thunder of artillery and the clash of steel. The slogan Sano Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarian, had ceased to be a mere political chant and had become a revolutionary mandate. For centuries, the emperor had been a divine figurehead, a silent sun around which the political world orbited but never touched. But now, the radical samurai of the southern domains, most notably Satsuma and Choshu, saw in the imperial throne a weapon. They saw a way to bypass the failing shogunate and unite a fractured nation under a single, sacred banner. This was the birth of the Meiji Restoration. It was not a simple change of leadership, but a seismic shift in the very foundation of Japanese existence. The Boshin War erupted, a civil conflict that pitted the traditionalist forces of the Tokugawa shogunate against the imperial loyalists. It was a war of two eras. On one side stood the old guard, fighting to preserve a feudal order that had defined Japan for 700 years. On the other stood the reformers, men who realized that to expel the barbarian, they must first learn to fight like them. As the imperial forces marched toward Edo, the inevitability of their victory became clear. The shogunate, once an iron fortress of stability, was crumbling under the weight of its own obsolescence. When the capital of Edo finally surrendered, it was not just a military victory. It was the death knell of the shogunate itself. The Tokugawa era was over. In its place, the young Emperor Meiji was moved from the secluded elegance of Kyoto to the bustling heart of Edo, which was renamed Tokyo, the eastern capital. The restoration was a paradox of radicalism and tradition. To restore the ancient power of the emperor, the new government had to dismantle almost everything that had made Japan what it was. The centralized authority they sought to build required the destruction of the decentralized feudalism that had empowered the daimyo. The modern state they envisioned required a unified citizenry, which meant the destruction of the rigid class system that had placed the samurai at its pinnacle. As the sun rose on the new Meiji era, the political landscape was unrecognizable. The emperor was no longer a distant deity, but a modern monarch, a symbol of a nation transforming with unprecedented speed. The government began a frantic, feverish process of modernization, adopting Western legal codes, building telegraph lines, establishing a national postal service, and constructing a modern, conscript-based military. But this transformation came at a devastating cost to the very class that had ignited the revolution. The samurai, the architects of this new era, were finding themselves trapped in the gears of the machine they had helped build. The restoration of imperial power meant the restoration of the state, and the state had no need for a hereditary warrior caste. The revolution was succeeding, but in doing so, it was rendering the samurai obsolete. The era of the sword was being forcibly eclipsed by the era of the steam engine, and the warriors who had fought to save Japan were about to realize they had fought to dismantle their own world. 1871, Tokyo. The revolution had won, but for the men who led it, the victory felt increasingly like a betrayal. For centuries, the identity of the samurai had been anchored to two things: their status as the moral and political elite, and their exclusive right to bear arms. They were the only ones allowed to carry the daisho, the pair of swords that served as the soul of the warrior. But the new Meiji government, driven by a desperate need to compete with Western imperial powers, viewed these very symbols of prestige as relics of a fractured, inefficient past. The first blow was economic. The government began a systematic dismantling of the feudal stipends that had sustained the samurai class for generations. These hereditary payments, once guaranteed by their daimyo, were replaced by government bonds that rapidly lost their value. Families who had lived for centuries on the prestige of their lineage suddenly found themselves facing the brutal reality of a cash economy. The warrior bureaucrats, men trained for leadership and combat, were being forced into the marketplace to become shopkeepers, farmers, or clerks just to survive. The dignity of the blade was being traded for the struggle of the breadline. Then came the legal assault on their very essence. In 1873, the conscription law was passed, a decree that struck at the very heart of the samurai mythos. It declared that military service was no longer the divine prerogative of a specialized caste, but the duty of every male citizen, regardless of birth. Suddenly, the peasant and the merchant could stand in formation, armed with modern rifles, trained by professional instructors to perform the same duties once reserved for the elite. The monopoly on violence, the fundamental definition of a samurai, was gone. The warrior was no longer a class. He was merely a soldier, and a replaceable one at that. The final, symbolic execution of the samurai way of life arrived with the Heitorei Edict of 1876. This law strictly prohibited the public wearing of swords. To the modernizing state, the sword was a dangerous symbol of insurrection and an obstacle to a unified national identity. To the samurai, it was an amputation of the soul. Imagine a man whose entire lineage, whose honor, and whose very sense of self was tied to the weight of the steel at his hip, being told by the state that he must walk the streets as an ordinary, unarmed citizen. The social hierarchy that had defined Japan since the Kamakura period was being erased by the stroke of a pen. The four-tier class system, warrior, farmer, artisan, merchant, was abolished in favor of a new, centralized equality. But this equality was a hollow promise for the former elite. They were not being elevated, they were being leveled. As the streets of Tokyo and the provinces filled with the sounds of steam whistles and the sight of Western-style uniforms, the silence of the discarded katana grew deafening. The samurai had successfully restored the emperor, but in doing so, they had invited a whirlwind of change that left no room for the traditionalist. They had helped build a bridge to the future, only to realize that they were the ones being left behind on the far shore of history. 1877, Kagoshima. In the southern province of Satsuma, the air did not smell of progress or Western incense. It smelled of gunpowder and defiance. While Tokyo raced toward a future of steam engines and telegraph wires, the men of Satsuma were looking backward, clutching the remnants of a vanishing world. At the center of this storm stood Seigo Takamori. To much of the world, Seigo was a hero of the Restoration, the man who had helped topple the shogunate and return power to the emperor. But to the disenfranchised samurai of the South, he was something more. He was the embodiment of the old soul of Japan. He was a man of immense presence, a leader who commanded loyalty not through decree, but through a profound, almost spiritual, connection to the warrior ethos. As the central government in Tokyo tightened its grip, stripping the samurai of their stipends, their swords, and their very purpose, a pressure cooker began to boil in the South. Discontent turned to fury, and fury turned to conspiracy. The samurai of Satsuma, many of them former retainers of the powerful Shimazu clan, began to gather. They were not merely protesting taxes or laws. They were fighting for the right to exist. They were fighting for the dignity of the blade in an age of the bullet. When the tension finally snapped, it was not a localized riot, but a full-scale civil war. The Satsuma Rebellion erupted, pitting a traditionalist army of elite warriors against the massive, industrialized might of the Imperial Japanese Army. The disparity between the two forces was jarring, almost surreal. On one side stood the samurai, men fueled by bushido, wielding katanas, spears, and antiquated matchlock muskets. They fought with a ferocity born of desperation, a belief that their death in service to an ideal was preferable to a life of quiet obsolescence. On the other side stood the New Japan, a conscript army of peasants and merchants, clad in Western wool, armed with modern breech-loading rifles and supported by rapid-fire artillery. The rebellion swept through the provinces, a final, bloody surge of the old world attempting to halt the tide of the new. But the era of the individual hero was over. The era of the machine had arrived. The imperial forces, utilizing superior logistics and devastating firepower, began to squeeze the rebels back toward their stronghold in Kagoshima. The end came at the Battle of Shiroyama. Surrounded, outnumbered, and outgunned, the remaining samurai made their final stand. As the imperial artillery tore through the hillsides, Seigo Takamori, realizing that the dream of a warrior-led Japan had reached its terminal point, chose to face his end with the dignity his class demanded. He did not surrender. He did not flee. In the smoke and the thunder of the final assault, the last true samurai fell. With Seigo's death, the rebellion died with him. The swords were officially silenced. The class was effectively extinct. The blood spilled on the hills of Kagoshima marked more than just a military defeat. It was the funeral of an era. The bridge to the modern world had been completed, and as the dust settled over the battlefield, Japan stepped forward into the 20th century, leaving the ghost of the samurai to wander the halls of history. 1878, Tokyo. The silence that followed the smoke of Kagoshima was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a vacuum. For 7 centuries, the heartbeat of Japan had been the rhythmic step of the warrior and the unsheathing of steel. Now, that heartbeat was being replaced by the mechanical, relentless pulse of the industrial age. The death of Seigo Takamori had done more than end a rebellion. It had severed the umbilical cord between Japan's feudal past and its imperial future. The transition was not merely a change in weaponry, it was a total reconstruction of the Japanese soul. As the dust settled over the mass graves of the Satsuma rebels, the Meiji government moved with a clinical, almost ruthless efficiency to ensure such a defiance could never happen again. The first step was the most symbolic, the Heitorei Edict. The right to carry swords in public was abolished. The katana, once the soul of the samurai, was relegated to the status of a museum piece, a relic of a bygone superstition. In its place came the uniform. The flowing silk kimonos and the lacquered armor of the daimyo were stripped away, replaced by the rigid, dark wool of the Prussian-style infantry. The individualistic, almost artistic combat of the duel was discarded in favor of the disciplined, anonymous mass of the conscript. This was the great paradox of the Meiji era. To protect Japan from the encroaching shadow of Western colonialism, the nation had to become, in many ways, exactly like the West. To defend the emperor, the samurai had to be transformed into the soldier. The warrior who once lived for personal honor and the mastery of a single blade was now required to live for the state, functioning as a single, replaceable cog in a vast military machine. The tools of this new reality were devastatingly efficient. The long, curved steel of the katana, forged through layers of folding and spiritual intention, was replaced by the Snyder-Renfield and the Murata rifle. These weapons did not care for the lineage of the man holding them, nor did they require years of meditative training to master. A peasant, once considered unfit to even look a samurai in the eye, could now be trained in a matter of weeks to fire a volley that could pierce the finest traditional armor from hundreds of yards away. The final evolution was the bayonet. If the katana represented the individual spirit of the warrior, the bayonet represented the cold, mechanical integration of the man and his machine. The soldier was no longer a master of the blade. He was an extension of the rifle. The intimacy of the sword fight, the breath, the eye contact, the singular moment of life and death, was replaced by the brutal, standardized violence of the line infantry. As Japan built its railroads, its telegraph lines, and its massive ironclad warships, the concept of the warrior was being fundamentally rewritten. The samurai had not disappeared. They had been metabolized. Their discipline, their loyalty, and their capacity for sacrifice were being channeled into a new, terrifyingly modern form of nationalism. The era of the sword had ended, but the era of the modern military state had just begun. The ghosts of the samurai were no longer in the mountains. They were marching in formation, carrying rifles, ready to carry a new Japan onto the global stage. 1899, London. As the smoke of the old world cleared, a new kind of phantom began to rise from the wreckage of the samurai class. It was not a phantom of blood and steel, but one of ink and ideology. While Japan was busy forging its industrial future, the West was busy romanticizing its feudal past. To the Western observer, the traveler, the diplomat, the scholar, the rapid, almost violent modernization of Japan was jarring. They saw a nation that had, in a single generation, leaped from the era of the daimyo to the era of the dreadnought. In their attempt to make sense of this paradox, they looked for a unifying thread. They looked for a philosophy that could explain how a nation of poets could suddenly become a nation of conquerors. They found it in a concept they called Bushido. But the Bushido presented to the West was not the Bushido that had lived on the battlefields of Sekigahara or the administrative halls of Edo. The historical reality of the samurai was often messy, pragmatic, and deeply inconsistent. For centuries, the warrior class had been defined by shifting loyalties, political maneuvering, and a complex web of land rights and clan obligations. Their code was less a rigid moral compass and more a set of evolving social expectations that varied wildly from one province to the next. There was no single, codified book of ethics that every samurai lived by. There was only the lived experience of a warrior caste navigating a world of chaos. However, the West did not want a messy history. They wanted a myth. Influenced by the writings of Western Orientalists and fueled by the romanticism of the Victorian era, a sanitized, idealized version of the samurai began to take shape. This Bushido was reimagined as a flawless, unwavering system of ethics, absolute loyalty, ritual suicide as a tool of honor, and a stoic, almost superhuman devotion to death. It was presented as a spiritual equivalent to the European chivalry, a noble, ancient, and unchanging moral architecture. This reimagining served a dual purpose. For the West, it provided a way to categorize the exotic East through a lens they understood. By framing the samurai through the concept of Bushido, they could paint Japan as a nation possessed of a unique mystical discipline that explained its sudden, terrifying military prowess. It turned the samurai into a literary archetype, the tragic, noble warrior whose soul was tied to his blade. But this myth had a darker, more profound consequence. As the Japanese intellectuals of the Meiji era looked back at their own history through these Western lenses, they began to adopt the very myth the West had projected upon them. In a desperate bid to forge a unified national identity, the Meiji state seized upon this romanticized Bushido. They took the idealized, Western-constructed idea of the loyal warrior and codified it into a state religion of nationalism. The Bushido that had been used to describe the samurai was no longer a reflection of history. It had become a tool of the future. The individualistic honor of the old warrior was replaced by a collective, state-mandated devotion. The myth had become the reality. The samurai had been dead for decades, but through the lens of the West their ghost had been resurrected, not to honor the past, but to command the soldiers of the new, Imperial Japan. 2024, Tokyo. The shadows of the imperial past have long since receded, replaced by the neon glow of a hypermodern megalopolis. The swords are gone, the top-knots are a memory, and the rigid hierarchies of the Tokugawa have dissolved into the democratic pulse of a global superpower. Yet, if you look closely at the fabric of modern life, through the flicker of a cinema screen, the pages of a manga, or the digital landscapes of a video game, you will see that the samurai never truly departed. They have simply undergone a metamorphosis. The myth of the samurai, once a tool of nationalism and a product of Western romanticism, has been reclaimed and reborn as the ultimate icon of global pop culture. Today, the samurai is no longer a specific historical figure, but a universal archetype of discipline, tragedy, and unyielding willpower. In the mid-20th century, this transition began in earnest through the lens of cinema. Directors like Akira Kurosawa bridged the gap between the old world and the new, using the samurai to explore deeply human themes of existentialism and morality. Films like Seven Samurai did more than just tell stories of combat. They translated the soul of the warrior into a visual language that the entire world could understand. Kurosawa's influence cascaded through decades of filmmaking, providing the DNA for the Western genre itself. The lone, wandering swordsman became the blueprint for the gunslinger, The code of the Bushido became the moral backbone of the cinematic hero. As we moved into the digital age, the samurai's evolution accelerated. In the realm of animation and manga, the warrior's spirit was infused with the fantastical. The samurai became a vessel for mythic storytelling, where the blade was not just steel, but an extension of the spirit, capable of cutting through demons and defying the laws of physics. This aesthetic, the sharp lines, the dramatic silhouettes, the fusion of tradition and the surreal, has become one of Japan's most recognizable cultural exports. In the world of gaming, the samurai has found a new kind of immortality. From the rhythmic, meditative combat of Ghost of Tsushima to the hyper-stylized violence of modern action titles, players do not just watch the samurai, they inhabit them. We step into their sandals, feeling the weight of their duty and the loneliness of their path. We experience the tension between the necessity of violence and the desire for peace, the very core of the warrior's struggle. But why does this archetype endure so fiercely in an era of silicon and satellites? It is because the samurai spirit addresses a fundamental human longing. In a world that often feels chaotic, fragmented, and devoid of clear direction, the idea of a life lived with absolute purpose, unwavering discipline, and a defined code offers a powerful psychological anchor. We may not carry katanas, but we all struggle with our own versions of loyalty, honor, and the pursuit of mastery. The samurai has transcended history to become a symbol of the eternal struggle for self-perfection. They are the ghosts in our machines, the heroes in our stories, and the quiet echoes of a discipline that refuses to die. The era of the shogun is over, but the legend of the warrior is infinite.